What I want to go through and what I hope you benefit from is the lessons that we've learned deploying approximately 12 pilot implementations of VMware vCloud Director environments across four service providers and actually 5 service providers and 6 or 7 enterprise customers. So what you're going to see here has been culled from the deployment teams around the world, that the lessons that we learned as we were making these early deployments of VMware vCloud Director. So before I start, I have a couple of questions just so I can tailor this appropriately. How many of you were involved in the VMware vCloud Director beta program? Anybody? Okay. How about how many of you have been able to attend a session in which they went through the technical aspects of VMware vCloud Director? Okay, a couple. All right. And then last but not least, I wanted to get a feel for the mix between how many of you are from service providers? Okay. And how many from enterprise customers that would be looking at private clouds? Okay, great. Got to have the mandatory disclaimer. I don't think there's anything in this particular session that is confidential, but we have to include this one. And I know you've seen it plenty of times, so I don't think we have to spend any time on it. So I'm going to go through 2 primary areas. I'm going to have a couple of slides up here that are just intended to show some of the challenges of implementing a vCloud from a very high level and then at a lower level. And then we'll go into the meat of it, which is the lessons learned. So vCloud challenges. VMware's VMware vCloud Director is implemented in such a way that it can be deployed both to support a private cloud with an enterprise customer as well as a public cloud from a service provider perspective, with the added benefit of being able to have a hybrid cloud which allows you to have workloads both in your private cloud but also be able to burst out to the service provider's public cloud, or you could also have hosted private clouds you could have your private cloud hosted at a service provider. So it's a very flexible infrastructure. And a lot of the challenges are similar between the two, whether it's a private cloud or a public cloud. What is it that you want to offer from a service provider perspective? What do you want to offer to your enterprise customers? From a private cloud perspective, what do you want to offer to your business units or whoever your end customers are within the private cloud? There are technical considerations which we'll certainly hit on. That was a big part of the lessons learned as we worked with this and deployed it. How to deploy it, both from a project management perspective and some of the details and lessons learned of what we learned while we deployed it. And then lastly, and to me, probably certainly as important as the technology in my humble opinion, is how do you operate this once you have it up and running? Presumably you're here, so most of you, if not all of you, are pretty, if not very familiar with virtualization. And you've probably learned by now, perhaps, that there are operational changes that should and need to take place in order to really benefit from a virtualized environment. That goes to a whole nother level when you're talking about a cloud environment. This is why I asked the question if any of you or how many of you had the benefit of attending a session that described how VMware vCloud Director functions technically. I'll go through this pretty quickly since most of you have been through it. So you've got basically 3 layers here. You have the physical layer that we're all very familiar with. We have the vSphere layer, which is the abstraction of those resources from the physical infrastructure, which at this point, how many of you are running vSphere versus an earlier version such as VI 3.5? How many are running vSphere? Okay, great. That's very good. And then when we introduce VMware vCloud Director on top of that, what it's really doing is adding another layer of abstraction. So what it allows you to do is it allows you to define service offerings, publish catalogs of these service offerings, and also, for the first time in my professional career, you can actually instantiate the service levels that you want to offer to your end customers. So you can define what your service levels are from a performance perspective, storage tier, et cetera, and you can instantiate those through what we call provider virtual data centers. Provider virtual data centers are a logical collection of the resources that are defined by the service level agreement or the service level that you want to offer out to your end customers. Lastly, on top of that, then we have organizations. It's multi-tenant by design, and you have organizations. You can have organizational virtual data centers. An organizational virtual data center is how you associate an organization with a service level or a provider virtual data center. You can have different organizations and their organizational VDCs sharing the same resources that you've made available in that provider VDC. And an organization can have multiple organizational VDCs, each one associated with a different provider virtual data center. So you're able to instantiate your service level agreements, make service offerings, and have organizations in a shared environment access those resources within the constraints of the service level, which is defined by the provider virtual data center. Okay, so I just wanted to set some context there. So moving into lessons learned, I'm going to cover 4 different areas. I'm going to cover strategy and alignment, technical, what I call hurdles, those technical aspects of it that we certainly had some significant lessons learned as we deployed, planning and deployment, and lastly, operations. So starting with strategy and alignment. Why strategy is particularly important, as we have found, is that you're probably all familiar, you've seen something very similar to this. This is the adoption curve for virtualization. We started out with pre-production. That lasted for a fairly good length of time before we started deploying Tier 2, Tier 3 applications in a virtual environment. And then with the advent of vSphere, you're really able to deploy Tier 1 and support Tier 1 applications within a vSphere environment. We believe, and what we're seeing already, is that the vCloud adoption curve is going to match fairly well the adoption curve for virtualization. The big difference is it's going to be at an accelerated pace. You're going to start with pre-production, you're going to start with Tier 2, Tier 3, you're going to move into Tier 1, but that's going to happen much faster than it did with the virtualization adoption curve. And that has some implications. From a strategy perspective, the way to control that or to address that is through a stepwise evolutionary approach to how you offer your services within the vCloud environment. What we recommend and what we have seen that works best is to start out with pretty simplistic infrastructure as a service in its pure form, which is basically virtual machines running an operating system. Once you're comfortable with that, you can move into, or at least in our experience, the best way forward is to move into more complex products that you can offer through the catalog, such as predefined database servers, predefined application servers, predefined web servers. And on top of that even, you can define what we call vApps. How many of you are familiar with the concept of a vApp? Okay, for those of you who aren't, a vApp is a logical container of virtual machines, which allows you to treat that container of virtual machines as a single unit. So within a virtual app, or within a vApp, you can define, for instance, a 3-tier architecture. You can have your web server or web servers, your application server, your database server, all defined within this logical container called a VApp, and those will all be treated as a single entity. For instance, from an HA perspective or even a DRS perspective, that entire VApp can be moved as a single unit. All those pieces can be kept together. You can also define order in which they're brought up, et cetera, et cetera. Lastly, you can move into the area of managed services. So what we have seen work well is taking this evolutionary stepwise approach to your offerings to your end customers versus a couple of the companies we worked with wanted to and attempted to take what I would call the Big Bang approach, where they wanted to jump right from nothing to managed services. And that introduced quite a few challenges. So we were able to convince them in the end that they really needed to back off and take a more stepwise evolutionary approach, and that made their environment much more successful primarily because operations was able to keep up with the demand. So start simple, add on as you get more comfortable with it and as the demand is there, and then ultimately you can end up with managed services and multiple service levels or multiple provider VDCs. So starting out, you might just implement a single provider VDC that has pretty constrained service level agreements. Again, just until you reach a comfort level and operations reaches a comfort level, and then at some point you can start adding more provider VDCs. That's the way we've seen this work the best. Another way to look to start this out is to start simple, to reinforce what I just said. From a technical perspective, what you see here represents a very simplistic view of our reference architecture. We've created a reference architecture for VMware vCloud Director for deploying it into both an enterprise and a service provider. So the idea here, and I'll talk about this a little bit further down, but the idea here is we architected this from a deployment perspective in such a way that you could minimize the initial investment in building your cloud out. And the way you achieve that is you can decide what your initial provider VDC is, what your initial service offerings are, and you can, we equate a provider virtual data center to a vSphere cluster. So the recommended way of doing this is, as I said, to equate a provider virtual data center to a vSphere cluster as opposed to having multiple provider VDCs within a single vSphere cluster. That can cause all kinds of capacity management challenges, if nothing else, as we found. So what we settled on and the way we architect these consistently now is to have a provider virtual data center equal to a vSphere cluster. What that allows you to do is you can start small and then horizontally scale as the demand requires it. You don't have to build out a 32-node vSphere cluster. You can start with a 3-node vSphere cluster and horizontally scale that out as the demand requires it. Okay. Technically, back to the same diagram. The architecture, let me just describe this a little bit. Again, this is based upon our lessons learned in deploying this. We break this out into a couple of different chunks. We have a separate management cluster just for all those management applications associated with VMware vCloud Director. So within there, as you can see, that's where your actual VMware vCloud Director cells reside, your vCenter servers reside, Chargeback resides, vShield Manager resides. All those management applications that taken together define the infrastructure for your VMware vCloud Director environment. And then separate from that, we have the vSphere clusters as I described, once again emphasizing that you want to look at a provider virtual data center is equal to a vSphere cluster. We have a separate management cluster primarily so that you can scale that one out separately, but also so that you're never consuming resources you want to make available to your end customers those resources are never being consumed by the management applications. Hence why we wanted to put that in a separate cluster. The other thing worth noting here, at the bottom left-hand side, is the database cluster. We actually have found that the best way to do that is to implement the databases that are required for the various management applications in a pre-existing managed database cluster if you have that. So the best way, because what that allows you to do is those databases are all being managed then and administered by database administrators. So they can just manage and administer those databases as they do any of the other databases in that managed cluster. If you don't have the managed cluster, then what we do is we implement those databases required for VMware vCloud Director environment in that management cluster, once again, so that we're never consuming resources that you want to reserve for the end customers. The next step in designing that then is coming up with the initial capacity requirements. That's very key to this cloud environment, is to sit down and really work through what you're going to offer and what you think, based on experience to date in your virtual environment, what the spread of those virtual machine configurations are going to look like. What percentage do you currently have that are consumed that are small, 2 gigabyte, 1 vCPU, or whatever it is that you create. And then there's a second dimension of that now with your provider virtual data centers or your service levels of how do you expect these virtual machines to be spread across the provider virtual data centers if you are implementing more than one service level. So you need to look at both of those dimensions to come up with your initial capacity design, and that will then in turn dictate how small you can start, again, being prepared to horizontally scale as the demand increases. At the bottom there you see I have something called apply the 60% rule. This is a rule of thumb that we arrived at, and what this is really applying to is when you have a provider virtual data center, you have customers on that provider virtual data center, organizational VDCs. When you get to about 60% resource utilization of that provider VDC, instead of adding additional organizations to that provider VDC, at that point, what we have found is it's better to start creating a second provider virtual data center, and any new organizations, whether that be a business unit in the case of an enterprise customer or an entire enterprise in the case of a service provider, put those new organizations on the second provider virtual data center. What that does for you is that provides you some headroom within that initial provider virtual data center for those existing organizations that are already consuming resources. And why that's important is in version 1 of VMware vCloud Director, you can't bridge an organizational virtual data center across multiple provider virtual data centers. In version 1, that an organization virtual data center must reside within a single provider virtual data center. So hence why we arrived at this 60% rule, so that you have headroom to grow those organizational virtual data centers that are already in that provider VDC, because you don't have the option with version 1 of simply spreading that organizational VDC across multiple provider VDCs. That's a very important point to keep in mind. That is being addressed, so that's going to be a relatively short-term challenge, but it is a challenge. The next technical, what I would call hurdle, is the networking. The networking is probably the most complex component of a VMware vCloud Director environment, primarily because of the flexibility that's been built into it. You can create everything from completely isolated vApp networks that are fenced off even within the organization so that no one else can access that vApp or those virtual machines. You can set up networking in such a way that only other individuals within the organization can access a virtual machine or virtual apps. And you can also set up in such a way that you can have access from the external world in. So that's a pretty simplistic explanation of it, but this is the most flexible and as a result, the most complex part of designing and implementing a VMware vCloud Director environment. And I would highly recommend that if you still have time today or tomorrow, if there's any sessions that are being offered yet on networking within this environment, I'd highly recommend you try to attend that, because this really is a complex piece of the puzzle. Another aspect of that, as you can see in here, let's see if this little thing works, the VSE, the vShield Edge devices. Those are the devices that, or I should say the appliances, virtual appliances, that allow us to have the various types of networks, the isolated networks, the firewalled off networks, et cetera, et cetera. Likewise, I would highly encourage you, I know there's some vShield Manager and vShield Edge sessions, I believe, still going on this afternoon and tomorrow. I'd highly recommend you try to attend one of those. Fortunately, the vShield Edge devices, depending on what networking mode you use, are automatically deployed when the network is deployed, but you can still manage them from the vShield Manager. The networking is sufficiently complex that I included this slide, not that I intend to go through it, because I could spend an entire session just on this slide probably, but more for your reference. These slides will all be available, as they always are, at some point when VMworld is completed. So I wanted to include this slide. One of our architects, Raman, put this together as a decision tree diagram for to help you determine what networking components you need depending on the use case that you're looking to satisfy from a networking perspective. So as you can see, this kind of reinforces, I think, what I said about the complexity. So I was hoping that this would help out in that respect. The other one that we have learned quite a bit about in this process is orchestration. To really make a cloud successful, it requires as much automation as possible. One of the things that we have experienced is a very pleasant phenomenon, I guess I should say. As we deploy these, the IT groups that we're working with during the deployments will suddenly, you can just see the light bulbs going on and the epiphany moments happening. It's, we can solve this problem, we can solve that problem, we can offer this. It's almost limitless what you can do once you have this implemented. But if you have to do that in a manual way and sustain it manually moving forward, it's going to be a pretty difficult task, because I guarantee once you release this, quote unquote, into the wild and you make catalogs available for end users, there's going to be quite an uptick in activity. I can guarantee that. So automating as much as possible is key. What I wanted to show here is that the way to automate is via the various APIs. It was interesting. I attended a session this morning. I think it was entitled "Saving Time with vCenter Orchestrator," and it just so happened what he demoed during that presentation, during that breakout session, was basically automating from there up. So through Orchestrator, he deployed a UCS blade. He loaded ESXi onto that UCS blade. He attached that UCS blade to a cluster. He used the NetApp operations manager to deploy or to carve out a data store, and associate that data store with the hosts in the cluster. And then using the vCloud API through vCenter Orchestrator, he deployed a provider virtual data center. He deployed an organization and an organization virtual data center to that provider virtual data center, as well as a number of vApps. So he was able to really do this horizontal orchestration. He showed that using vCenter Orchestrator. We've also done this with BMC, and I was involved in a project in which the customer used Oracle's orchestration engine to provide the horizontal orchestration, and in their case also the vertical orchestration, as well as the horizontal orchestration across their BSS OSS applications. So as soon as possible, when you're embarking on this journey, look at orchestration and how you can start automating this. I think the last one in the technical section is monitoring. The monitoring already exists for a lot of the lower level. We've had this for a very long time for the ESX, the vSphere layer. With VMware vCloud Director, we expose today it's JBeans and ActiveMQ, the message bus. Those events are exposed, so they can be accessed via Java and can be fed into your existing monitoring system. We also have, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Hyperic, but a Hyperic has a lot of the capabilities out of the box built into it to manage pretty much the entire vCloud stack. We're using it today to monitor the events that are occurring within the VMware vCloud Director, and that it in turn can send those events on to whatever manager of managers you might have implemented in your environment. So using the existing APIs, using the existing capabilities, you can do a certain level of monitoring of the VMware vCloud Director environment itself, and certainly underneath. What's interesting with this, and what we continue to work on, is now you need to approach this monitoring from more of a service perspective. So you're not just monitoring infrastructure anymore, you're monitoring a service. So you need to shift your thinking a bit to think of this more from a service perspective than just a pure infrastructure perspective. What I mean by that is if a call comes into Tier 1 from a customer, they may just say, this service isn't working, and that may be all they can really tell you. So they need to be able to, Tier 1 needs to be able to correlate to that service the various layers of the vCloud stack underneath it to effectively troubleshoot that particular problem. Okay, planning and deployment. This one is another one that's has personal history with me. I've been involved in a number of these from a project management perspective. I can't stress that first bullet enough. That seems like an obvious one, but you can have a strong project manager, but you've got to make sure that they understand all of the internal processes within the organization. I've worked with customer project managers at both ends of the spectrum. I worked with one who was a fairly good project manager, but didn't really understand the internal processes for the company that they worked for. And that caused us quite a few challenges as we moved through the project. They didn't understand the testing process. They didn't understand that they needed 30 days to get through integration testing, user acceptance testing, operational testing. They didn't understand what was required from a change management perspective, how change management was going to be affect the project while we implemented the VMware vCloud Director environment. So it's very important not just to have a strong project manager, but one that is intimately familiar with all of the internal processes, because when you implement this, this will touch many different groups, which brings me to that second bullet, to identify early on in the project the roles and responsibilities from the executive stakeholder all the way down the stack as it relates to stakeholders. If you're a service provider, you need to make sure that you include your product managers early in the process. That's part of what I meant when I said early on strategy and alignment. You want to make sure that your product managers are aligned with the vCloud vision of the company. I had another experience with a service provider where when we first went in, you would have thought that the product managers, they really had never talked, they had no idea what the cloud strategy was. So it's very important to get the product managers involved as early in the process as possible as well. Clearly, all the aspects of infrastructure, the compute layer, the network layer, the storage layer, testing, get them involved early on to make sure that you understand what the testing requirements are, what they're going to test, how they're going to test it, how much time they need to test. Again, from personal experience, in one particular project that wasn't handled very well, and so we had a very unpleasant surprise as we got to the end and closer to their controlled introduction. And then lastly, of course, operations, and I can't stress that one enough. You need to get operations involved early and often in the process as you plan and deploy the environment. I didn't include security as a separate one, though security is extremely important here. I view security as part of operations from an ITIL perspective, but security is important to get involved with this as well, and I'll touch on that a little bit further down. And finally, to have a solid, detailed, and I can't stress enough detailed, project management plan, and that's from a work breakdown structure perspective as well as a communication plan perspective. This will have visibility probably to the highest levels within the organization for certain, if not within the company, at least up to the CIO, CTO level and perhaps beyond. So having a good communication plan and keeping those executive stakeholders informed of progress is very important. And then to reinforce again the stepwise evolutionary approach. This is the journey that we have found to work very well. There's 3 phases to this. The first phase is to really sit down and understand your readiness for not only deploying this from a technical perspective, but again, probably more importantly, are you operationally ready to administer and run this environment in a sustained manner as it moves forward and grows. Secondly, moving into a pilot phase, a controlled introduction phase. And then lastly, once you've learned the lessons from that pilot phase, then and only then go into a full production mode. This is the journey that we have found to work the best. Okay. Next 2 slides are a bit dense. There's a lot of bullets on here, but these are some of the important lessons that we learned, some of the details. Design, and when you think you're done, design some more. You really need to design this one before you implement. This is not something you can grow organically from a proof of concept and just release it into production. It will fall flat on its face, I guarantee it. You need to design this up front and design it thoroughly. Part of that, you need to determine what your catalog strategy is. The environment has a lot of flexibility as it relates to your service offering catalogs. You can have global service offering catalogs that are available to everybody in the environment. You can have catalogs that are specific to an organization, so only individuals within that organization can access the services that are in that catalog. If you allow it, end users can upload their own virtual machines and vApps, convert them to templates, and make those part of their own catalog. So your catalog strategy is very important. The next one, again, personally experienced this one. Determine what your templates are that you're going to offer early in the process. The reason for this, why I included this, what I experienced was I knew this had to be done in the project. I brought it up in virtually every status call, asking if they had identified their templates, defined their templates, and they did not until about 45 days before we were going to go live. And just as I warned them and expected, security needed to assess and analyze those templates to make sure it met their certification, security certification. They found problems, so those templates had to be rebuilt. And in this particular case, that was a relatively time-consuming process. So try to identify your templates early on, get security and operations involved to review those templates and bless those templates as early in the process as possible, or you will definitely regret it if you wait too long. The next one, because of the potential size, you really need to think through your naming conventions for the environment and come up with naming conventions that are scalable, because you could potentially have to scale this out quickly, and the last thing you want to do is be limited or run into problems because you didn't consider something as simple as naming conventions. The next one, you want to assign your roles according to a policy of least privileges. We, out of the box with VMware vCloud Director, there's a number of roles that are predefined. What you want to do when you assign individuals to those roles is make sure that they're in a role that gives them just the capability they need to perform their function, to perform their job, and nothing more. So a good security practice, a good lesson learned is to apply a policy of least privileges when you're assigning individuals roles and responsibilities within the environment. The next one, I touched on this briefly before, but it was worth noting again. Single storage tier per provider virtual data center. With version 1 of the product, when VMware vCloud Director deploys a virtual machine or a vApp, it's going to randomly deploy it to whatever data stores or it has available within that provider virtual data center. So as a result, you can't really define tier 1, tier 2 storage, tier 3 storage within the same provider virtual data center because you have no way of controlling where it's going to place that virtual machine. So if storage tiers are something that are important, and they certainly increasingly are within your organization, you just need to consider that and make that part of your service level and hence the provider virtual data center that you create. So you may have a tier 1 storage that's part of your platinum service level, a tier 2 storage that's part of your silver service level, but those would be separate and distinct provider virtual data centers. Another one to be wary of is in version 1, single sign-on. If you have an external portal and you want to jump off from that external portal to the VMware vCloud Director user interface, in version 1, there's no single sign-on capability. So your end users will end up logging in twice, once into your external portal and again into the VMware vCloud Director user interface. Again, something that's being worked on, and keep your eyes and ears open for that. But as of version 1, that's something you need to be wary of. The way around that, and the way some of the customers have gotten around that, is by using the APIs to integrate directly into their external portal. So they have a lot finer level of control using the APIs. It's very important you want to follow the prerequisite components of the installation guide. You want to have all the information available when you start. That ties back to the design, and most importantly, design. You want to identify all the information, what your network pools look like, what your IP address ranges are that you're going to associate with a pool, what your VLAN pools are, all the various aspects. There's a lot of configuration when you install and deploy VMware vCloud Director. So you want to identify and have all that information available when you start the deployment and the configuration, or you're going to find yourself going back and forth a lot. Another one that we've certainly run into is to ensure that all the required firewall ports are opened. Those are all defined within the installation configuration guide. Look at that and make sure all those firewall ports are open. That can make for a interesting troubleshooting session if they're not. And last but not least, be methodical. If any of you have worked with Lab Manager or Lifecycle Manager, the installation configuration is relatively similar to those in the sense that when you've completed the configuration of a section, you have the green check mark, and so you know that you've completed that. A couple more. vShield Manager installation configuration. You need one vShield Manager per vCenter server. Another one, you want to understand your security certificate import options. If you are using a specific certificate from GoDaddy or something, you want to make sure you have that available in advance. If you're doing wildcard, there's a different import mechanism for that. So you need to be aware of that and be prepared for that. Configure your NFS transfer storage properly. With VMware vCloud Director, you have the capability of allowing your end users to upload their own virtual machines and vApps. To do that, you have to have NFS storage, and you've got to make sure that that NFS storage has been configured properly. You also want to be careful when you're configuring LDAP, as there is no big red reset button. There's no easy way to reset to your default configuration for LDAP. So that, again, kind of ties back to making sure you have all your information available up front. And last but not least, for the real techies in the room, I threw one in. The library is not automatically installed in Red Hat, so just be aware of that. You need that library, and it's not automatically installed. And then last but not least, again, reiterating, involve operations early and often. Okay, speaking of operations, let me go through this last bit pretty quickly here. We only have about 15 minutes left. Operations. This graph represents how we viewed the tipping point within virtualization for when you really need to start evaluating and adjusting your operational processes. Up to about 500 virtual machines, you could get by with using the same processes you used in the physical infrastructure world. When you hit 500 and above, and to really be efficient and realize the benefits of virtualization, you needed to make the proper adjustments to your operational processes. With the cloud, you don't have that luxury. With the cloud, you need to start that and look at that from the beginning. You can't wait until you have 500 VMs because that could occur within 2 days. So you really need to look at your operational readiness and adjusting your operational processes early on. I just want to touch on some of the more critical ones. Review your organizational strategy. How many of you would consider your company having a virtualization center of excellence? Anybody? Okay, a couple. That's something you need to think about and perhaps go back and propose to management. Especially for a cloud environment, is to have a single organization that is your vCloud center of excellence. So everybody knows to go to them. They have responsible for the environment. They're responsible for capacity management. They have representation on the change management board, et cetera, et cetera. And then what you see surrounding that is what we consider the ecosystem, the various aspects of the organization that they need to interact with. And what we recommend is for each of those organizations, you assign an ambassador who meets regularly and often with the appropriate members of the vCloud Center of Excellence. so that there's a very tight integration within the environment. Service catalog and service levels. This slide is not meant to reflect a recommendation on our part, but rather what we find in reality. One of the basic characteristics of a cloud, one of the basic defining characteristics of a cloud is on-demand self-service. A lot of organizations aren't ready to make that leap. So what we have seen and what we have helped implement in those cases is IT still controls, so end users would still come in with a service request. IT would go to the catalog in the appropriate organizational VDC and deploy the VMs or the VApps based on that service request. And then evolving to actual end user on-demand self-service. So again, I want to stress, this is not a recommendation. If it were up to us, everybody would go immediately to on-demand self-service because that's really where you want to be. But the reality of the situation is many organizations really aren't ready to make that leap. The service catalog. This is really pointed primarily at the service providers within the room, especially if you come from a telecom. I've worked in the telecom industry. A service level within telecom is the one I saw most recently was almost 3 pages long. Every little backup, every little item in the managed services was a separate line item. What we have learned and what we recommend is you try to consolidate those into a predefined service level that you can then instantiate within that provider VDC. So your service catalog actually takes on 2 dimensions. You have your virtual machine configurations, and then you have your service levels, and you would charge accordingly. But the point is to try to condense the various aspects of the service levels into service levels and apply them that way instead of 3 pages of one-offs. Capacity management. What I really want to hit on here, because I know we're running out of time, is the very top. Establishing your vCloud specific capacity and budget forecast. People are used to doing trending so they can see historically what has happened and try to predict what's going to happen based on that. That worked fairly well in a pure virtual environment. In a cloud, not so much because of the transient nature of the virtual machines. It's really difficult just to rely on historical trending. So the second point is, I have it in red because this is the one that we rarely see put in place but really needs to be, and that is a pipeline so you know what's coming. Especially if you're a service provider and you're going to offer this out to your enterprise customers, is to make sure you establish an official pipeline with the sales organization so you can also see what's coming and feed that into the equation for your capacity management. And then lastly, determining your point of expansion. So what that means is, how long does it take to provision the physical infrastructure? Taking that into consideration, and based on that, you can calculate what your thresholds are so that if a particular provider virtual data center starts hitting a certain threshold on a regular basis, you know that you can still provision the additional infrastructure that's needed, and you'll still have the capacity to satisfy your existing consumption. Lastly on here, worth noting, is the ensure financing for your vCloud is a capacity as a service. What I mean there is the traditional way of building out environments and expanding environments is on a project-by-project basis. That's pretty difficult to do in a cloud, again, where it can expand and contract because of the transient nature of the virtual machines. So you really need to work with the people who control the money to look at this as more of a capacity as a service as opposed to funding it purely on a project-by-project basis. And we have something that can help with that 2 slides down. Next to last, the configuration management. As you can see here, when I talked about complexity early on, even from a configuration management perspective, the various CIs that are needed to really define the configuration management database for a vCloud environment is quite a bit expanded from where it was in a pure virtual environment. And last but not least, Chargeback. Chargeback is an integral part of the VMware vCloud deployment. It allows the metering of the environment, the metering of the virtual machines, and being able to calculate costs or associate costs with those, the utilization of the environment, both from a metering perspective as well as a fixed cost perspective. So you can build your costs up within Chargeback. And why this can be useful, going back to the capacity as a service, is we've worked with several customers to set up Chargeback in such a way that they can actually use the revenue from the organizations using the cloud to fund the cloud. So by doing Chargeback, they could get around having to do expansion based on a project by project basis and use the revenue from the cloud to fund the expansion of the cloud. Okay, three key takeaways I'd like to see you take away from this. Number one is the stepwise evolutionary approach to deploying this and rolling out the services you want to offer. Secondly, employing a seasoned project manager who, most importantly, is very familiar with the internal processes of the organization and is empowered to work across organizations. And lastly, taking that cross-functional approach to your planning and your deployment, so including operations early and often, including the various stakeholders from the beginning, because they will all have an important part to play in the planning, the design, and the deployment and operations of the environment. So with that, we're told we need to leave this one up to remind you to fill out the surveys, but we have a couple minutes here. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
For the enterprises that you deploy to the internal cloud, can you give us an estimate in terms of how big the companies are and how much budget they spend and how long it is?
Sure. So the question is, can we give some idea of the size of the enterprise customers that we've worked with to implement private clouds? They have ranged from a national footprint within the Americas to a global footprint. So we've worked with a couple of very large organizations from an enterprise perspective. We were deploying pilots for them. So in that particular case, even for the largest, as we did more of these, I think the fastest we were able to deploy was under 30 days from start to finish. But we have been doing several of these, so our first one took longer, of course. By the time we got to this one, we were able to do it in less than 30 days, and that even included their project manager being on vacation for a week. So we really did it in 3 weeks, which was pretty incredible. It included design work, yes, and I'm sorry? Exactly. That was the advantage, is we have a reference architecture. What I showed earlier on, those different pods, that's what we implement at every customer. So, we have a reference architecture we can work from, so it's a matter of customizing that reference architecture to that particular customer's environment. And fortunately, those customizations are really focused around things like networking. So it's pretty common, even between service provider and enterprise customer. I think by my estimation, having worked in both, there's probably about an 80% overlap, even between enterprise customers and service providers as it relates to the design implementation of these. Yes?
Can you give us how many deployments we have today?
Of this, I know exactly how many we have. We have 11. We have 4 service providers. They're all international service providers, and we have 7 enterprise customers, ranging from, again, a national footprint to a global footprint. Yes?
So I'm one of those service providers, multiple $1 million, if you want to know how much to implement. I won't tell you how many. Could you detail the algorithm for load balancing across the data stores for your provider VDCs? Do you know what the algorithm is?
I don't know. I'd have to get a hold of a technical person to describe that algorithm. I'm sorry. Yes?
What tools do you have to measure the capacity management?
Yeah. So the question is, what tools do we have for capacity management? There are some third-party tools, and we also have Capacity IQ. Capacity IQ, the next release of it will be integrated, or it will be VMware vCloud Director aware. But since we equate a provider virtual data center to a cluster, you can still use Capacity IQ because it's cluster aware. So you can still manage capacity based on the cluster. And since we equate provider VDC to cluster, it works. What it's missing and what they are adding is it's not resource pool aware today. So if you're looking at capacity management tools, third party, whatever, specifically for a VMware vCloud Director environment, you want to find one that is resource pool aware because that allows you to manage the organizational VDCs. I'm not aware of any that are resource pool aware yet. You probably have time for one more. Yes?
In doing the readiness assessment, did you develop any gap analysis tools or methodology?
Yes, we have. We developed a set of questionnaires that when we do a readiness accelerator assessment, we send those questionnaires out in advance to have the customer answer, and then we can analyze those, and based on the answers to the questions, we can home in on specific areas, whether that be in strategy, technical, or operations. I'd have to look into that and see if those are available. I mean, it's IP, so.
So can I send you an email?
Sure. Okay. Any other questions, quick, before we? All right. Well, thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry.